Okay, so thank you for that introduction. Just set my stopwatch going so I know how long I've been talking to you for. So what I'm going to talk about today actually segues really, really nicely from Ben's talk before, which kind of left us with the idea of what bits of intelligent systems should be automated, what should we hand over to the computer, and how much of that should we keep in the human domain. And the idea around that is how do we encapsulate the knowledge that we have in experts whilst making either naive users or naive or learning professionals make their life easier. So I'm going to start at a reasonably familiar point of, I might be starting there? Yes. Excellent. So a reasonably familiar anchor point, which is the idea of the cocktail party effect, which I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with and has probably even was just experiencing up in the coffee room. There are a number of things that we use to navigate this cocktail party scenario and be able to make sense of speech in what is usually quite an adverse signal-to-noise ratio. And one of those things is familiar voices. If you're familiar with someone's voice, you will be able to hear them better in noise. There are studies that say that we can hear our spouse better in a noisy environment than we can hear a stranger. Similarly, if we're conversing in a familiar language, it's much easier to hear speech in noise in a language that's your first language than a second or any subsequent languages. And also, we can use directional cues. And in all of these ways, we've built up a mental model of either the voice, the language, what a sound from a particular direction sounds like, and we use that to make sense of all this onslaught of incoming information. And this is called a schema or a schemata, and it's essentially a mental model, a mental representation of what instances things have in common, what instances our spouse's voice has in common, or the English language. And it works as a reference frame for all our incoming data to slot into. And if it ticks the boxes of being familiar to that reference frame, it's easier for us to piece together, which means we can understand speech in more adverse signal-to-noise ratios. And there's two ways that we can develop this. One is a top-down way from our intellect. We can build these models by consciously analysing the data that's coming in. And the other way is bottom-up. And this just is by sheer aggregation of information that's coming into our senses and establishing patterns between them. And this occurs in all sorts of parts of perception. It's very common in visual perception. It's the reason that we have visual illusions is because all of us have a schema for both a duck and a rabbit, and even though neither of those things are actually there, that pattern of what makes a duck or a rabbit allows us to pick out the commonalities, what it has in common with ducks and rabbits. It's the same thing we do when we build automatic speech recognition systems, and this is a very crude example of a hidden Markov model chain. But if we're recognizing a series of speech and the first word is penguins, based on usage in the English language, there are some words that will be more likely to follow that. They might be eat or catch. It's not hugely likely that those words are going to be repeated. It's not hugely likely that the sentence is going to go penguins eat catch, because that's not how the English language works. And then there are certain things that are more likely to follow on from that. We're more likely to say penguins catch fish or penguins eat fish. So there's these relationships that, this is essentially a bottom-up approach. What we do when we train automatic speech recognition systems is throw sheer amounts of data at them, and they figure out the probabilities of things coming after one another. And we as humans do the same. If you're a fan of The Simpsons, as I am, if you've got Homer Simpson standing there going, the word that is far more likely to follow that, if we don't hear what he says, is donuts than it is bell pepper. Though you get bonus points if you can figure out the episode that references. And it's something that in research we've known for a reasonably long time. There's reasonably famous speech recognition test for use in noise from a guy called Bilger, who was working primarily in the 70s and 80s. And the two different parts of this test, one of them has low predictability sentences, so this is one without a reasonable mental model. We're trying to recognize the last word, which is sword, but there's nothing in that sentence that allows our mental model to kick in and help us to recognize that word. And then you've got high predictability sentences, which do have cues for our mental model. Because we're all reasonably familiar with things like Arthurian legends and fairy tales, it seems reasonable that if we're talking about a dragon, we might be slaying it with a sword, even if in noise we don't hear the whole word sword. And now, the first part of my PhD actually added to this research and utilised this test, but rather than just using things that trigger our mental model from language, I looked at whether the same effect can be found when you add non-speech sounds. So if we're talking about killing a dragon with a sword, we can add sound effects that add to that. And I'll give you an example.
He killed the dragon with his sword.
Which is one of my favourites because it's particularly squelchy sounding. It, in the same way that the language adds to whether we can determine that word sword, that sound effect plays on that mental model, or at least we hypothesise that it played on that mental model and helped us recognise it in noise. And the results are that it did. So what we've got here is we've got percentage word recognition up on the y-axis and the 4 different conditions. We've got low and high predictability, and that replicated quite nicely the results that Bilger got. And then we've got these conditions with sound effects as well on the 3rd and 4th columns. And what we can see is that when we don't have any mental model to use other than just English grammar, we've got a 36% word recognition in -2 dB signal to noise ratio. When we add in cues for that mental model, we can almost double that. When we add in sounds that also trigger this mental model, we go from the 62% even further up to 74%. So it's adding more cues, ticking more boxes in this mental model, which allow us to cope in higher levels of noise. Now, something to note about this is results with normal hearing people. So how does this change when we start to consider people who have a hearing loss? And now, these schemas, these mental models still exist for people who have hearing loss. Bilger's work showed that you still get this same high level of improvement when you add in cues for that mental model. But there's challenges. You get that improvement, but you require starting off at a higher signal-to-noise ratio. And there's less sort of working headroom to make these connections because of the cognitive load that hearing loss already imposes. So I repeated this study with some people with hearing loss, and what we've got here is how much having the sound effect improved their recognition. So it's relative to their own personal baseline. And along the bottom, we've got pure tone hearing loss in their better hearing ear. Now, the experiment was over a mono, like a single speaker, so it makes sense that whichever ear has the most residual hearing is going to dominate in that scenario. And what we see, so it was about 60% improvement for normal hearing listeners. And for low levels of hearing loss, so like below sort of 30 dB, we can see that they're trending towards that level of normal hearing. But what we notice is that once we get to about 40 dB hearing loss, there's no benefit. And there's actually an active detriment when you get to higher levels of hearing loss. And we hypothesize at least that this is to do with how much extra cognitive effort there is to piece all these things together. They no longer have the spare working capacity to recognize these extra sounds and fill in the model. So they become no longer useful. And this leads into ideas about, so pure tone audiometry, for those of you who may not know it, is basically the most common way of measuring hearing loss, but it's also rather crude. What it does is we play frequencies at different sound levels and keep making them quieter till the person can no longer hear it, which tells us a lot about what frequencies people can hear and very little about what effect hearing loss has on their day-to-day life. In contrast to that, we have what we call super threshold loss, so above these pure audiometry thresholds. And this includes things like tinnitus, loss of temporal resolution, loss of frequency resolution, loudness recruitment, which is essentially a reducing of the dynamic range that people can cope with. All of these things that aren't characterized by this standard model of hearing loss, but nonetheless have a massive effect on how their hearing performs in everyday scenarios and what we can do to make content more accessible to these people. There's a really nice way of sort of summarizing these two ideas that a guy called Plomp came up with, again, back in the 70s. And it's thinking of it in terms that our cochlear loss is essentially an attenuation. Due to hearing loss, there is some attenuation of the incoming signal. And we can compensate for that, but what we can't compensate for, or at least we can't yet because we don't have the models of the hearing loss, is the distortion element. So we can make it louder, but that doesn't necessarily make it clearer. Now, there are 11 million people in the UK with some degree of hearing loss. It's about 1 in 6 of us. And most of those people have mild to moderate loss. And what that means is in this scenario where I'm amplified and everyone's reasonably quiet, they can probably hear okay. But stick them in the coffee room upstairs where everyone's chattering and they will struggle. And because we have an aging population, that figure is rising. By 2035, Action on Hearing Loss, who are a hearing loss charity, estimate that 15.6 million people in the UK will have some degree of hearing loss. That's 1 in 5 people, 20%. And when it comes to broadcast, it's not only 20% of the audience, because older people watch the most amount of TV. Broadcast audience research board statistics show that those over 55 watch more television than any other demographic, and they consistently do year to year. The document only has the last 10 years of statistics, but every year in the last 10 years, they watch more television in hours per day than any other demographic, which makes making content accessible to people with hearing loss really, really important, and something that impacts a huge amount of people. So to really sort of fine-tune what the challenges are, in my research, I undertook a survey at the end of last year. And one of the questions that I asked of my respondents was to name any specific examples of times they found television speech hard to understand. And there's the word cloud. If you're not familiar with them, the larger the word is, the more commonly it appeared, and also the darker it is, the more commonly it appeared. So there's some pretty common things that we would expect: background, dialogue, the perennial mumbling problem. And it seems like drama is the most complex, which makes sense because it is generally the type of content that has the most complex soundtrack, the most going on. And some of the other key issues that were identified, and these were from most commonly identified at the top of this screen through to least commonly identified at the bottom, it's the same kind of ideas around availability of subtitles, accents, dialects, and the balance of different audio objects. Now, the balance of different audio objects is what I'm going to focus on. It's what my research has been focusing on. Because when it comes to a technical solution, these problems basically break up into two, or these issues break up into two problems. One is audibility. We've got to record it well to begin with. But that's a production end decision. Accessibility is about making it consumable by people who have either permanent or temporary hearing impairments. And by temporary hearing impairments, what I mean is you or I sitting on the tube with a huge amount of background noise trying to watch something on our phone. It's something that we all go through patches of, and the challenges are reasonably similar. And in that scenario, even if we've got a good mix, a good clean mix, it might not be accessible given our scenario or given our level of hearing impairment. Now, I'm going to take a bit of an aside through the world of baking, and some people will be familiar with these slides. And some people will be familiar with the concept of object-based audio, but object-based audio is a tool set that I'm using to address this problem. And the easiest way to explain it is cake. So traditional broadcasting is a cake. It's a complete cake that arrives at your home. It might be delicious. You might enjoy it, you might not. It might not be your thing, but it arrives as a complete product. All of the levels, everything is already set. Object-based audio or object-based broadcasting breaks down this paradigm by, rather than sending the complete product, we're transmitting the ingredients, a recipe that tells us how to put them together, and then we've got a renderer in our home that puts them all together, hopefully a bit more competently than this guy. So we've essentially got objects, which may be audio, maybe visual. We've got metadata that tells us how to put them together. And then we've got our renderer, whose job it is to put them together based on both this metadata, but it also gives the potential to put in our own personal constraints on it, based on our needs or even just our preferences. And what this allows us to do is things like variable length content. If we don't have time to eat the whole cake, rather than taking just an incongruous slice, we could create a smaller version that is coherent and complete, but just smaller. We can adapt for different speaker layouts depending on whether our house has stereo, 2.1, nice surround system, maybe 7.1 if we're really lucky, or 7.1 with 4 height channels. I've been asked to do a 22.2 system, but I haven't baked it yet. So it means that we've got something that's adaptable based on a whole bunch of different things that we can tell it at point of service. And for accessibility, what is really important is it means that if we've got a cake that's got raisins in it, and we're allergic to raisins, rather than trying to pick out the raisins once the product is complete, we just don't put them in the first place. And this gives a basis for really, really powerful personalisation for people that have some degree of hearing impairment, because it gives the control over to them in their home. So how do we actually do this? Because we can't just lay this whole pile of ingredients at every person's feet and go figure it out. We've got to have some logical structure to what we give people in order to... Are you giving me a 25-minute time, or am I going for 25 minutes or 30? 30. Oh, my clock's wrong. Cool. So the first iteration of what we did to try and make this a simpler thing to engage with for the user was using a DTS system and some object classifications from the S3A project. And that gave us this sort of interface, which is essentially mixing stems, which you or I is going to find reasonably intuitive and probably quite enjoy. But it's not necessarily the most accessible thing for every end user. So we had a master volume, and as you can see, you can change the dialogue, music, foreground, and background sound. My supervisor did this experiment and got a whole bunch of people with varying degrees of hearing impairment, which you can see on the pie chart, to adjust the levels, and found that people were reasonably consistent in and of themselves, but varied quite a lot across the different categories in level, except for the fact that everyone made speech louder. So we can conclude that this is not something that one size is going to fit all. We can't just transmit a clean audio or accessible audio channel. It's not going to solve the problem for everyone. And by trying to make everyone the same, we're probably going to make it worse. It was really well received by participants. It's always nice for someone to do an experiment and just ask, when can I have it in my living room? But it's still not the simplest or most accessible way of doing it. And it also, by just categorizing things by their characteristics, removes a lot of the nuance that the producer puts into the content. And this is where integrating the experience of the producer comes into it. And what we've got is essentially a balancing act. We've got to have this low barrier to uptake that makes it simple, but we don't want to rid the creative integrity from the content. So I'm going to do a bit of an aside onto the theory of affordances, which is something that Gibson came up with, again, in the 70s. Good era for psychology. And affordances are essentially a way of looking at visual perception that have been applied to a whole bunch of different things. It says that the affordances of an environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes for good or ill. And here we mean, object means, or animal means basically anything. So if we take a nice example, the example usually used is a cat sitting on the mat, but we've got a dog on a rug. If we take the physical descriptions of this situation, we can describe it in excruciating detail. The dog is on the rug is on the floor supports the rug and the dog, which means it must be strong, it extends to the wall. There's a whole bunch of information that we can get from that, but it's not really meaningful. It's just like that cocktail party scenario. It's an overwhelming amount of information. So how do we make it meaningful? We can think about it in terms of what it affords. So what does the dog afford us? If he's sitting up and attentive, which he is, he might be protective. He might afford us protection if someone comes in. Alternatively, he's looking a bit skittish with wide eyes. If we try to pat him, he might not be receptive to that. He might not afford us that opportunity for interaction. And that's thinking about the dog as a dog. But what about the dog as part of a narrative, as part of a piece of television content? We can then think about what it affords the viewer. He's sitting up and attentive, maybe someone's approaching from outside of screen. This is not limited to the visual element, but the sounds that come with the dog are going to tell us information as well. So if he might be angry because another dog is present. It affords us the information that something's about to happen. Or potentially, which I love because I played that earlier and someone else was facing away and went, oh, puppy, which proves the point really nicely, that gives us an information. It tells us something about what might happen. He might be lonely. He might be about to get up to mischief. And I think the best example of what these different audio elements afford us in terms of progressing a narrative is Jaws. With the music, we've got a scary shark. Without the tension and emotion that the music provides us, we have a ridiculous mechanical creation that is not going to scare anyone in their right mind. So how do we tell what's important to the narrative and then leverage it to make it better for people that might have some sort of barrier to access? And the answer to that is expert knowledge. We have a huge amount of producers that intuitively do this. They use the affordances of different sounds to create emotions, to create different parts of the narrative. And so to explore this, we had a workshop with a producer of the Turning Forest, which I'm sure everyone knows and you're going to get more of later. And we looked at ranking the different objects in that mix by how important they are to the narrative to see if we could create a better mix for people with hearing impairment. So we basically have a really basic VST, which was created as part of the S3A project that we used, and we did a lot of discussing and collecting qualitative data on the idea of this narrative importance in mixing and how it could be integrated into workflows, or how we could get that metadata from current production workflows. And a lot of the themes that came up were ideas around signposting, that if we can't just fill and clutter the soundscape with sound, a sound is more important when it signposts something, and then we can drop it away. And also, as we worked through, the concept of groups developed. We had a tool within the VST to create groups, and they started off with really physical characteristics, like that first part of the affordances, describing physically what these sounds represented, and moved to much more affordance-based ideas. It's like, how essential are they? What are they telling us about the story? Rather than categorizing them by the sounds. And this was reflected, the idea of the signposting, in this use of the sounds for the same creature. So the creature jumps into the water, and then it swims around. It jumping into the water is a much more signifying feature than it swimming around afterwards. And yeah, that's the swim example. And what we ended up with was a hierarchy of all the different objects. Now, this is a very complex mix, and a lot of mixes for telly wouldn't be this complex. But we've got this hierarchy of narrative importance, and we've got all of these objects. So I've got this really informative metadata about what the importance of these objects are to the story. And this is coupled with an end user interface, which is kindly coded by the guy in the second row there, John. And what it is to create, despite the complexity of all of this production end stuff, we want something that's quite simple for the end user to use, even simpler than having to adjust for faders. And what we ended up with was a single single dial that allowed you to go from the most complex mix through to the one that only had the narratively important parts. So at no point did you degrade the integrity of the mix, but for someone with a hearing impairment that's struggling in a scenario with lots of things going on, you've made it simpler and more accessible. And in a bit more detail, the flow of sort of audio and metadata that goes on in this system. We've got works on a variation on an ADM file, and we're working towards making that just a regular ADM file or implementing it in other types of object-based file formats. But this gives you a bit of an idea of the relationship between the flow of metadata and the flow of audio, whether you're just playing it back or whether you're inputting it through the VST in the, at the moment it's in Reaper because it's the most flexible. And just for the sake of demonstration, this is it set up in our listening room as a sort of living room scenario with it on a television, and we've got the glowing blue control that allows you to slide between the different complexity levels. So I'm going to give a little bit of a demo, a video of it working. So enjoy the turning forest.
Some forest, where the trees constantly shed copper-coloured leaves, and there's always a chill in the air.
So we're moving from
Amelia
the complex end to the simple end.
It was heaven for our 8-year-old selves. Miles and miles of space to run around. Trees so tall and wide
notice the
that we
music
could
drops
chase
out
each other
quite
and never be
significantly.
found. When we were there, we became Nathan and Amelia, the prince and princess.
And so this gives
of
you
the
an idea
autumn
of what's
forest.
going on under the hood. There's different gains and attenuations that are applied to each
Except one
category in
day,
that hierarchy.
when Amelia ran off
And they're
without
reasonably
me.
straightforward. They're just linear gain changes at the moment. But we can see that as we go round, we get a boost on the category 0, so the narrator comes up as you reduce down the parts in the lower complexity categories.
That was the first time I saw it.
Amelia!
It appeared as if from nowhere, staring at me.
So that gives you a bit of an idea of what the end user interface looks like and what sort of adjustments it's making to the sound. And you'll note that that sort of low rumbly sound was actually quite high in the mix even at that simplistic end. Because discussing with the producer its role, it's there to add tension. And there's nothing else in the story, in the sound mix, that will add that tension if that's not there. Whereas the flute pieces at the beginning and the sort of ambient music, if that's not there, you still get the impression of a happy group of children running around a forest. So based on, I'm going to give you a little bit of end user feedback that we got from on the control from a focus group. And it's quite a lengthy quote. And usually I wouldn't put that much text on a slide, but I think it really encapsulates the point of what we're doing. Being hard of hearing isn't a lot of fun, but referring to the control, this puts us back in control. It means that we are in control of what we hear, whereas most of the time you're not in control of what you hear, and you have to do so much adjusting to get people on the right side or changing places with them. It means that we're in charge of what we hear, and that's quite empowering. And that's the point of what we're doing. We're trying to both maximize that producer intent and creative integrity whilst allowing people to engage better with the content. And where the work goes from here is just a lot more science. Quantitative evaluation is something that's on the to-do list. Implementation in other formats and making some adjustments to the algorithm based on the feedback from both the producer end as well as the focus groups. So given that this is all about intelligence and automation, the question kind of becomes, or the question I'm going to leave you with at least, is can we automate this further? I mean, we're getting pretty good at recognizing the physical characteristics of different sounds. Could we automate this system? And my answer to that is Harry Potter and the portrait of what looked like a large pile of ash, which if you're not familiar with, I recommend. It's quite amusing. It's a book chapter that is trained on all the Harry Potter books and then spat out a new Harry Potter chapter. I'll read you a bit. Ron was standing there and doing a kind of frenzied tap dance. He saw Harry and immediately began to eat Hermione's family. Ron's Ron shirt was just as bad as Ron himself. Which is to illustrate the point that intelligent systems have not yet mastered the idea of narrative. And until they do, we need to work on ways to make the best of what intelligent systems can do to make people's lives easier, but still integrate that expert knowledge, that very human inclination to tell stories into our intelligent systems. And that's where I wrap it up. Thank you.
Yes, I was thinking exactly the same thing. What can you do further? And it seems to me that you're modelling attention. What you're actually doing is modelling attentive processes. And you quote Gibson, and of course Gibson came out of the Gestalt way of thinking. And actually what you're doing is kind of a Gestalt modelling of foreground and background perception. So could you not use a machine learning kind of approach to simplistic Gestalt modelling? For instance, in a given scene in a narrative, when an object is introduced, it's quite important that it's clearly introduced, and after that we just know it's there, so you can bring it down, as it were.
Which is exactly the signposting sort of thing that came out of the production workshop. And I think that's interesting because on the one hand there is the potential using machine learning like that to simplify the categorization of things and maybe for some simplistic things do the whole job, but you've also got, whilst attention is the sort of output aim, that doesn't encapsulate what we might attend to the most, maybe not be what the producer wants us to attend to the most. So we still need to know what it is in that story that they're trying to convey in order to make sure that that's conveyed over to the audience. So yeah, it's definitely something to look into.
Next question.
I was just wondering if at all you ever looked at any automatic systems. At the moment, this is quite active. The listener has to move a dial around to decide the level, and I think it's one of those things. You put a dial in front of someone, they're always going to twiddle it, so they kind of get disengaged. One of the things that we've looked at a little bit in the past was getting live feedback from the environment to work it out, because a similar problem very early on when we were doing stuff with the BBC is, people complain that things sound muddy in a tube, but you go at home and then they sound really compressed and horrible. So I'm wondering if you've ever looked into that kind of thing, or how you could take this system and make it a bit more automatic and a bit more personalised without the user having to make a load of decisions on their own.
Yeah, so on that note, you should definitely talk to Bruno afterwards. So as part of the S3A project, it's not something I've been working on, but as part of that project, there is a speech intelligibility meter that has been developed that has the ability to be implemented in that way, to be actively listening to environmental noise or background noise in the track and make those automatic adjustments. So that's absolutely something that could be integrated into this. I haven't, because at the moment I'm just trying to finish my PhD. But it's something it's something that could very easily integrate and would mesh quite nicely.
Any further questions? I've just got a quick question. With respect to sort of the technological barriers of this type of thing, so what I mean by that is when am I in my home going to get access to an object audio-based system where I can play around with things? In terms of roadmap, how far ahead are you guys thinking?
Well, I mean, a version of this can quite easily be implemented in MPEG-H, and we're currently working with Fraunhofer to do that. So because that propagates the menu to your TV, if it's already MPEG-H compatible, you just use your remote control and access the menu on screen. So as far as if the TV is object-based compatible, which more and more devices are being made that are, so probably the next generation of TV, you could hypothetically just do it on your remotes. So the barrier to uptake is reasonably low, and that's something that we've been trying to keep an eye on the system such that it is reasonably easy to implement, that it's not going to be something where you have to buy this piece of tech and that piece of tech and that piece of tech. It's hopefully something that will just be in the next generation of TVs.
So uptake of major manufacturers, basically LG, etc., Sony. You've got to make the tellies that'll do the job.
Well, yeah, and there's already the push towards object-based, so hopefully we'll ride that.
Super. Any further questions? Okay. Right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Lauren again.